Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, so today, folks, we are going to be talking about the American luxury car. And by American luxury car, I mean traditional American luxury sedans and their smaller counterparts, the personal American luxury car. We are going to be talking about the origins of the American luxury car. We are going to be talking about the life of the American luxury car, the heyday, what they were known for. We are going to be talking about the death of the American luxury car and how it left us, when it left us, and the legacy that they leave behind. And we are going to be talking about my personal opinion on the luxury cars of today and how they stack up to American luxury cars of old and what cars have come to replace this segment, because to those who are privy to what is happening in America right now, car makers are moving away from sedans and cars to SUVs and crossovers instead. So the American luxury car in general is rapidly becoming extinct. So let's get started. And once again, thank you for tuning in, my fellow car lovers. So we are going to start by discussing the origins of the American luxury car. Let's just think about some of the most popular brands that have existed over the years. Of course, there were lots that tried to get into the luxury car game, but I'm only going to mention the ones that people, car enthusiasts, I should say, know, and the ones that really left an impact on the American car scene. So you have Cadillac. Cadillac was founded in 1902 from the remnants of the Henry Ford Company. It was founded by Henry M. Leland, and they had a LaSalle version of Cadillac, which was basically a smaller, cheaper version of Cadillac, almost a baby Cadillac, if you will, that ran from 1927 to 1940. Buick was founded in 1899 by David Dunbar Buick. It was actually the first car company in the American, no, not in the American Motors, that's a different company, but in the General Motors dynasty that still lives on today. And Buick obviously still lives on today. Lincoln was founded in 1917 by none other than Henry M. Leland, who actually left Cadillac to start Lincoln in 1917. Lincoln had a Continental marque that basically produced their personal luxury cars from 1956 to 1992. This is not to be confused with the Lincoln Continental, which was a separate but related line of vehicles. Chrysler was founded in 1925 by Walter P. Chrysler, and they had their Imperial line from 1955 to 1975. They had a 6-year hiatus, and then in 1981 to 1983, they they produced Imperials again. Packard, which is now defunct, was founded in 1899 and lasted 57 years until 1956. Mercury, now defunct, was founded in 1938 and ended in 2011. Oldsmobile, which is also now defunct, is actually the oldest one on this list, or one of the oldest. Was founded in 1897 and lasted until 2004. Duesenberg, which is now defunct, was founded in 1913 and lasted until 1937. And you had, those were basically those American luxury sedans. These American, not luxury sedans exclusively, but these American car companies that produce these luxury cars really cemented what it meant for luxury to exist in America, what a luxury car was. Dare I say, Americans even invented the idea of a luxury car. Germans produced the idea of a car. They invented the modern automobile, and then Americans took that idea and ran with it. One of the things that Americans were well known for doing was coach building. What coach building basically was that you would buy the chassis from the car company with the platform and the motor and everything, and then you would go to a separate car company, or I guess a separate car company that didn't produce fully functioning cars. They would only produce bodies for the cars. For example, Fleetwood, before it became integrated into the Cadillac lineup as the top of the line flagship model, was actually a separate car company that produced car bodies for Cadillacs. For example, if you were to buy a Cadillac V16, which was a thing at the time, you would buy the motor and the chassis from Cadillac, and then you would go over to Fleetwood, and then they would have a lineup of body styles, whether you wanted a Phaeton, whether you wanted a Roadster, whether you wanted a traditional sedan, whether you wanted a Landau or a Landaulet. You would go in and you would choose from their catalog, because there were no computers back then. There was no internet. So you would go in, choose from the catalog, and then you would pay a separate fee for them to custom build the body to the way you wanted it, and then they would tack it onto the chassis for you. And that's why car companies at that time, of several American luxury cars, were one-off builds. They had chassis from the car company. They had motors from the car company that were pretty much the same all around, but the bodies were completely different. So finding one of those and restoring it nowadays is next to impossible, because those cars were very unique. They were one-off. And of course, it wasn't Americans only that did this. Pininfarina in Italy was, a styling firm. They were a coach builder too. There were several others in America, but Fleetwood is the one that I know, and Fleetwood is the one that comes to mind when people think of American coach builders. Innovation. Innovation was huge for American car companies at the time. The most innovative one, and I'm not biased at all, I'm just stating the facts, was Cadillac. Cadillac was the first car company in the world to offer a closed body as standard equipment, or to offer a closed body in general. Cadillac also invented the electric starter. So if today you have push button starters, or if today you have electric ignitions, you have to thank Cadillac. I remember briefly mentioning this in an earlier podcast of mine. What happened, what the story goes, at least in American car folklore, if you will, was that there was a Cadillac that had a crank to start the engine, just like all cars had cranks to start the engines. You would manually crank the engine in the front. Well, when a car would backfire, the crank would also spin in the opposite direction, and you could break an arm, you could hurt yourself. What had happened was, the Cadillac had backfired, and then the crank had spun in the opposite direction and given the owner a head injury, and the head injury ended up later taking the owner's life later on. So what had happened was, Henry M. Leland, who was the head of Cadillac at the time, he said, "I will not have my cars kill people. We are going to create a safer alternative to this and a more efficient alternative to crank starting your engines." And thus came around the electric push button starter that we all know and love today. Cadillac invented that. And much later on, with the last generation of the DeVille in 2000 to 2005, Cadillac came out with a night vision camera. A night vision camera was almost the modern day descendant of the eye, not the all-seeing eye, but the eye that Cadillacs would have on their dashboards in the 50s that sensed cars' headlights coming in the opposite direction, and it would dim your own car's headlights so as to not blind the other driver. Well, this was accomplishing the same feature with the addition of night vision on top of it. So not only would it dim your headlights, but Cadillacs would also, that had these features, which was the DeVille with the GHS trim on them, they would sense what was coming in the night and then give you a vision, or not a vision per se, but an image on the screen that was mounted in the dashboard that would make it easier to see in the dark at night, especially on roads that were not well lit. It wasn't heat vision, it was night vision in the sense that it would see what was coming better than a human eye could see, and then it would project the image onto the screen, which is something that car makers, as far as I'm privy to and as far as I know, have not done since. And of course, the technology for this was very expensive, so Cadillac ended up discontinuing that. It was a very rare option to find it anyway. To find a DeVille DHS with night vision these days is very, very difficult. But nonetheless, they had it. And not only Cadillac was innovative, Duesenberg basically invented what is now known as the luxury sports car. Dare I say, car companies like Bentley, car companies like BMW, car companies that have sporty models, they are the spiritual successors to Duesenberg. Duesenbergs were also coach built, and Duesenbergs had very powerful engines. We're talking about 250 horsepower back then, which was unheard of. No car had that much horsepower. And we're talking about large, low-stress engines that just lumped along and that move these things like God knows what. We're talking about the American version of the Bentley 8-liter. I mean, these cars were overbuilt. They were gorgeous. They were long, they were large, and they could top 150 miles per hour. And we are talking about back in the 1920s and 30s, which this was unheard of. The Duesenberg Model J is the one that I speak of. Duesenberg Model J was one of, if not the fastest production car at the time that it came out. You had Oldsmobile. Many attribute the invention of the production line in the automotive world to Henry Ford. That is simply not the case. Henry Ford capitalized on the production line to produce the Ford Model T, but it was Ransom Olds who founded Oldsmobile in 1897 that actually invented the idea of the assembly line for the automobile. At the time, Oldsmobile had a car called the Oldsmobile Curve Dash Runabout. That was the one that was mass produced, and in the time, I believe it was the best-selling car in America. And Lincoln introduced the idea of the personal luxury car with the Continental series starting in 1948. So when you have all of these car companies from America that started these innovations, that had these ideas, coach building, sports cars that were also luxurious. You had personal luxury cars. You had electric starters. You had night vision. You had all sorts of other things that car companies all across the globe, I'm namely speaking about Europe, with Germany and Great Britain producing their luxury cars. These are things that Germany and Great Britain never thought of. These are things that, if they have them today, they have to thank the Americans, because Americans invented the idea of a luxury car. Like I said earlier, Germans invented the idea of the car, but Americans took it and ran with it and invented what we now know as the luxury car. And we know the luxury car and all of its variants. The personal luxury car, the luxury sports car, those were things that Americans invented. American luxury was once what British and German luxury aspired to be. Think of it. Nowadays we have Rolls-Royce, we have Bentley, we have Mercedes-Benz, we have BMW, and we have several others across the globe too. Those luxury car companies have to thank the Americans. I'm not speaking as a haughty American over here for all of my non-American viewers, if you are out there. All I'm saying is that American luxury was really the original luxury in the car world, and all others are descendants of ideas that were first brought in by Americans. The first Mercedes-Benzes were more functional than anything. They were well built. Mercedes-Benz has always been well built, keeping with the German philosophy of cars, but they were not always luxurious. Same thing with BMW. BMW were sporty, but they were not always luxurious. Rolls-Royce has always been luxurious, but was never as luxurious as the American car companies. And same thing with Bentley. So when you have the legacy that the American luxury car brands from the early days left behind, we really have to thank America and the great minds that had these luxury cars and these great companies that produce them for luxury cars the world over. We have to thank America for that because they invented such an idea. Next segment, we are going to be talking about the life and the heyday of the American luxury car and the American luxury sedan. And then we are going to be talking about, in the last segment, please stay tuned, what my personal opinion is, why I miss American luxury, and what I think has come to replace it in a sense. So thank you for listening, and please stay tuned after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, car lovers and regular viewers who may not necessarily love cars. This is the segment on the life of the American luxury car. Let's just get started by saying many car companies, like I said earlier, tried to get into the luxury game. Only a few made a name for themselves. There are so many that I can think of. One that comes to mind is Kaiser Frazer. There's Studebaker. There's so many that I can think of that tried to get a foot into the American luxury car game. And those ones simply did not survive. Not to say that they don't have a special place in the hearts of American car lovers, and even car lovers abroad, but those, be it financial issues, be it poor marketing, they just didn't make a name for themselves. They didn't survive. The car world is a world that is based on the principle of survival of the fittest. If you are not fit, you will not survive. And that's basically what happened to those car companies, unfortunately. I would say the heyday for American luxury, and don't quote me on this, this is not from a specific source or anything. This is just from my own research, what I have seen and what I have heard. The heyday for American luxury, I would say would be from the 1950s to the 1970s. So you had about 3 decades, all of the 50s, all of the 60s, and most of the 70s of American luxury car craze, if you will. These cars, the philosophy was the bigger, the better. These cars were large, comfortable boulevard cruisers with tons of chrome, room for 6, and mile-long hoods adorned with hood ornaments. You're going to be thinking of the cars that you used to see in the old movies. You're going to be thinking of the cars that the American presidential limousines were based off of. These cars, let me tell you, these cars were able to be afforded by only the richest of the rich at the time. It's not like you can go to your Cadillac dealership today and get a lease on the new Cadillac XT5 or whatever. I mean, this is not what that used to be. These were the ones that cars car people and people who just, own cars in general, they would work their lives to be able to save up to buy a Cadillac. They would work their lives to be able to save up to buy a Lincoln or a Chrysler Imperial. These were the cars that if you had them, you had made it in life. You were a hot shot, you were a businessman, or you were a hardworking American that saved your pennies and spent them towards the end of your life on something you've always wanted to own, a luxury sedan. These are not the regular run-of-the-mill cars you see today. These cars were the likes of the Cadillac Fleetwood, large, almost limousine level cars that came from the factory that way, 19 feet long, room for 6. If you got the Fleetwood 75 limousine, room for 8, over 20 feet long. These cars were ridiculous. This was oh goodness, this was the era that ushered in what is known as American excess. I mean, cars had always been more optioned in America than anywhere else. They had always been more luxurious in America. But, you had World War I that hindered car production. You had World War II about 20-something years later that also hindered car production. It wasn't until after World War II in the prosperous 50s that American car companies really started to have money, started to have, I guess, the guts to come out with some of these designs. I mean, you think of the 1959 Cadillac with these fins that were like 6 inches tall. I mean, you had the Delta wings on the backs of the Buicks. You had these large scalloped fenders on the Lincoln Continentals. These things were ridiculous. This was American excess at its finest, in its purest form. I mentioned the Cadillac Fleetwood and the Cadillac Eldorado. Let's not forget the Buick Electra 225, the Buick Riviera, gorgeous personal luxury car made by Buick, lasted up until, I believe, the early 2000s, if not the early 2000s, late 1990s. Lincoln Continental was the one that invented the personal luxury car in 1948. You had the Continental Mark series that lasted from 1956, I believe, to, 1992, I believe, was the last official Continental Mark, but then the last Lincoln Continental was in 2002 or something like that. These Lincolns were basically the last holdouts of American luxury cars that I will mention in the next segment, which includes the death of the American luxury car. You had the Chrysler Imperial. This was when Chrysler built good things. This was when Chrysler not only built good things, but made good cars that were reliable, that were well built, that had quality control. This was the Chrysler Imperial. Unfortunately, Chrysler is no longer like that, but in the time period, when you got a Chrysler, you got something that was on par with Cadillac, you got something that was on par with Lincoln, and you got something that was on par with car companies across the world. Chrysler was one of the nicest car companies to exist, was one of the nicest cars you could buy. But unfortunately, Chrysler, after several poor financial decisions and financial bailouts, is simply not like that anymore. There was a Chrysler Cordoba, which was their attempt at a personal luxury car, not really as well known as the Eldorado or the Riviera or even the Thunderbird from Ford, which I did not include on this list because that's from Ford, not from Lincoln. You had the Mercury Grand Marquis, which was always a lesser version of the Lincoln Town Car or the Lincoln Continental. And you had the Mercury Cougar, which for many years shared a platform with the Ford Thunderbird, which was a personal luxury car from Ford, like I said earlier, not from Lincoln. You had the Oldsmobile 98, which is really an unsung hero in the American luxury car scene. These Oldsmobiles, when fully optioned, when well optioned, could rival Cadillacs. I mean, you should see them. The styling was was very traditional. Long, low, gorgeous, slab sides, comfortable interiors. An Oldsmobile 98 was a nice car, even though people don't tend to remember them because Oldsmobile ended in 2004. But when you add an Oldsmobile 98, and sometimes when you see them on the road today, you can clearly tell that was an American luxury car in its truest form. And you had the Oldsmobile Toronado. The Oldsmobile Toronado was part of like the big three, if you will, as far as the GM trifecta of personal luxury cars, especially back in the 50s. You had you had the Chrysler. Not the Chrysler. This is GM we're talking about. We had the Cadillac Eldorado. You had the Buick Riviera, and you had the Oldsmobile Rocket 88, which would then evolve into the Oldsmobile Toronado in later years in the 60s and the 70s. These were personal luxury cars. These are the traditional luxury sedans and the traditional luxury coupes. These cars, not to be mistaken with cars of nowadays, they made no effort to make them small. No effort to make them efficient, and no effort to make them sporty. Comfort and build quality was the main focus. This is something that, as I will gripe about later on, is something that I miss. This was the luxury car in its truest form. It's like taking everything that previous car companies had tried and taking everything that people had as far as ideas go and then boiling them down to their purest form. This is what it was. This was the American philosophy of luxury cars. And I mentioned this in the German luxury cars podcast that I had done. This was what really, I guess, brought the American luxury car to life, but it was also the same thing that killed it, was the fact that this formula was so exact that it was hard to change. It was hard to modify, and that, as a result, caused them not to be able to keep up when the German rivals began to come in from Europe. These cars would cement luxury into the minds of Americans and automakers the world over. Like I said earlier, every car company that produces a luxury car today has the Americans to thank, has people like Ransom E. Olds to thank, David Dunbar Buick, Henry M. Leland. They have those people to thank. Walter P. Chrysler, as far as the luxury car, its very existence started with these great minds, started with the companies that they I guess started, that still many of them live on today and still continue to produce luxury cars. These cars were also very severely hurt by the fuel crisis of the 1970s. You will find that the fuel crisis comes up a lot in American car history, and it's because those cars were really hurt by that. They were really hurt by the fact that gas prices were through the roof. Gas was not as available because of the Arab oil embargo. These car companies that produced these cars that had no regards for efficiency, no regards for environmental friendliness. These things were not things that people cared about back then. They cared about large boulevard cruisers that you could turn the steering wheel with one pinky, that could seat 6 people, 8 people if you got a factory limousine. And the very notion of factory limousines is ridiculous by today's standards. You know, limousines are coach-built cars, much like hearses. They're special. They're made for funerals or for proms or for any special occasions or for presidents. These are not cars that private people can just buy anymore. But there was a time that you could actually do that. And it's sad. It's sad that an art form could really be hurt by such an event in history. You think of cars as usually just transportation. But I think of cars as an art form. And the American luxury car, be it the American luxury sedan or the American luxury coupe in the form of the personal luxury car, the American luxury car was an art form in the purest sense. These things were not created with budget in mind. They were not created with comfort in mind. It was all about style. It was style over practicality. These cars were not meant to be practical. That was not the point. Style was really king. Style was king. Luxury was king. Size was king. These were the things that made the American luxury car so great, and what we think of when we think of American excess. It's just the fact that I'm thankful to be able to have experienced this. I'm thankful to have experienced the American luxury car in the form of my first two cars. They were both Cadillac DeVilles. I'm thankful to have seen these cars on the road. I'm thankful to the people who preserve them, who put them in museums, people like Jay Leno who have tons of them that preserve them and keep them on the roads so that future generations could know what American excess was and how it really began as far as American excess in the automotive world. So please stay tuned for the next segment in which I speak of the death of the traditional American luxury car and what I like to call the neo-traditional American luxury cars that came after the traditional ones began to die off. And please stay tuned for the last segment in which I talk about my personal opinion on the death of the American luxury car, the traditional American luxury car, and the cars that I think are really coming in to cater to that market that still longs for traditional luxury that doesn't care much about sport. So please stay tuned after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, podcast listeners and car lovers alike. This is segment 3. We are going to be talking about the death of the traditional American luxury car. And we are going to be talking about the neo-traditional American luxury cars that came as these cars were dying off and as they no longer became viable in the market. We are going to be talking about several car makers and car models that you would be familiar with. We're going to mention the Lincoln Continental, the Lincoln Town Car, the Cadillac Fleetwood, the Chrysler New Yorker, the Chrysler Imperial. We're going to be talking about all of them, so please enjoy. I would say the slow death of the traditional American luxury car would begin in the 1970s after the fuel crisis. I just recently ended the last segment on a rant of the fuel crisis, so I'm not going to go in depth with it. But basically, to boil it down to a couple of points. gas prices were too high. These cars, the American luxury cars, were gas guzzlers, and they were inefficient compared to foreign competition that began to creep in during the 1970s, and that really began to make a name for themselves in the 1980s. So that's exactly what happened. The problem was deemed terminal. If we were to think of the death starting out in a slow, long, drawn-out process like a disease, as morbid as that sounds, the disease was deemed terminal in the 1980s when German and Japanese luxury showed up on the American car scene. The Mercedes-Benz E-Class. The Mercedes-Benz E-Class is a German luxury sedan, for those of you who don't know. The E-Class was the executive class, if I were to put it that way. It was the mid-size offering from Mercedes-Benz. I'm not going to include the C-Class because the C-Class was not necessarily extremely luxurious. It was a premium car, but not necessarily a luxury car by the most traditional sense. But the E-Class had several variants. The E-Class had a sedan version, a coupe version, a convertible version, and a station wagon version. This was one of the killers of the American luxury car. Because when you think of it, American luxury cars had convertible versions. American luxury cars, especially the ones from like Buick and Chrysler and whatnot, had station wagon versions. American luxury cars had coupe versions, had sedan versions. They had all the versions that the E-Class had. And I don't think it was a coincidence that when the E-Class showed up in the 80s that you could get it in so many different variants, because Germany knew what it was doing. In order for it to get in on the American luxury car scene, they had to offer a car that could do everything that an American car could do and do it better and do it more efficient, and so that fuel prices weren't as expensive and things weren't as inefficient as the American luxury cars of the time period. You have the S-Class. The S-Class was basically meant to kill the likes of the Fleetwood, to kill the likes of the Lincoln Town Car, to kill the likes of the Chrysler Imperial. And I would say the S-Class, as far as killing these cars, may not have been successful, but as far as eating some of the market share, oh, heck yes, was it successful. I mean, the S-Class sold very well back then in America, as expensive as it was. But when you think of it, they were not marketing to the lay people like you or I, broke college graduates or blue-collar workers. They were catering to the richest of the rich in society. So the people who would have dropped the equivalent of $80,000 in today's money on a Cadillac would take that and drop it on a Mercedes-Benz S-Class because it was seen as a status symbol if you could afford something foreign. If you could afford something foreign, you were automatically seen as better and richer as those who couldn't afford something foreign. And when you are in the business of being an executive, when you are in the business of being a business person, this was what you looked for. You looked for something to show off your wealth. You were not concerned with being humble. You were not concerned with not being flashy. You were concerned with keeping up appearances and getting what was the latest and greatest thing. So your grandfather might have owned a Fleetwood when he got to the head of his company, but when you get to the head of your company, Fleetwood no longer cuts it. Continental no longer cuts it. You want S-Class. You want 7 Series from BMW. You want something that if you have a problem, you have to call up the factory in Germany to get them to produce the part for you. That was true, I guess, luxury in the eyes of these people. So that's why they may not have killed the American car company with the S-Class, Mercedes-Benz that is, but they definitely took out a huge market share, which still is prevalent today. People who make it in America now, even middle-class people who have a bit of money, they're not going to go out and buy a used Cadillac DeVille. No, they are going to go out and buy a used Mercedes-Benz S-Class so they can keep up the appearances. This is something that I believe the Germans well calculated upon coming into the American car scene. Of course, I mentioned the 7 Series, but you had the BMW 5 Series, which was a sportier alternative to the American cars. Because like I said in another podcast, the American cars were not sporty by any stretch of the imagination. The sportiest cars from America that were ultra luxury cars were probably the personal luxury sedans, and even those weren't sporty. I mean, you had a Torino-based Ford Thunderbird in the 1970s. You had, I guess the Buick Riviera could have been seen as somewhat sporty, but these cars were not sporty. These were not sporty like BMW sporty. They were simply a bit lighter because they weren't 4 doors, and they had the same engine. So if you had the same engine in a lighter chassis, I mean, you could go faster than the sedan, but you weren't really a sports car. I mean, that's not something that the Americans focused on when it came to luxury. You know, in the American mind, those were mutually exclusive. You could not be both sporty and luxurious. The only one that did that up until this date was the Duesenberg, and the Duesenberg had been defunct for probably 40, 50 years by the time, you know, German car companies started coming into America. So that was not even a thing for Americans. Like I said, German cars were more efficient. They were more modern. They had better reliability, especially Mercedes-Benz of the era, and they had performance with comparable size. You take a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, like a 500 SEL from the time period. You take a Cadillac DeVille, you take a Mercury Grand Marquis, you take a Lincoln Town Car, you put them in a room. The Lincoln Town Car is probably going to be the largest, then the Mercury Grand Marquis, then the Cadillac, and then the S-Class. But we're talking about largeness in like within a few inches. I mean, we're not talking about several feet of difference here. A Mercedes-Benz S-Class from the time period was large, but it handled better. It was better engineered and was infinitely more reliable. How many S-Classes do you see from the 1980s still on the road compared to Cadillac DeVilles from the 1980s? Okay, I'm going to let you answer that question. How many S-Classes do you see on the road compared to Lincoln Town Cars of the time period? How many S-Classes do you see on the road compared to Mercury Grand Marquis, to Mercury Cougars, to Buick Electras? I mean, you see a lot more Mercedes-Benz S-Classes because they were simply better built and better engineered. The American cars would rust. They would fall apart. Reliability, especially in some cars like Cadillac, was not very good. I mean, these cars were built well, but they were not as well built as the German cars that we have come to know and appreciate and respect and even love in some cases here in America. Let's not forget the Japanese cars that came in on the scene. You had Lexus and Acura and Infiniti. Lexus came out with the LS in the late 1980s, I believe in 1988. Acura came out with the it was the Acura Legend was their flagship model, I believe, in 1987. And Infiniti came out with the Q45, I believe, in 1989. So you had the late 80s and the early 90s for the traditional Japanese luxury cars. I mean, the Japanese, unbeknownst to many Americans, had been making luxury cars in the form of the Nissan Prince, the Nissan Gloria, the Toyota Century, the Toyota Crown. I don't think Honda had any luxury cars until Acura, but the Japanese have been creating Japanese luxury cars, traditional Japanese luxury cars, which I should totally do an episode on that now that I think of it. They were producing them for about as long as luxury cars were even really popular. But the fact that the Japanese made the leap, leaving the Japan-only market and coming to America, signaled a great shift in the luxury car identity as far as it was cemented in the minds of Americans. Japanese luxury cars were cheaper than German cars. And this was what made them so successful. because they were cheaper than German cars and they were still better built than American cars and more reliable and more sporty and more stylish and still carrying the cachet of, oh, it's foreign, it's not American. That's how you add things like the Lexus LS sells so well. I mean, and let's think about it. A 1990 Lexus LS 400. How many Lexus LS 400s do you see on the road compared to Cadillac Broughams, to Cadillac Fleetwoods, to Cadillac DeVilles, to Lincoln Town Cars, to Mercury Grand Marquis, to Lincoln Continentals, to Chrysler New Yorkers, to Chrysler Imperials and everything? You see a lot more Lexuses on the road than you see any of those cars from that time period, and which is a testament to their quality. Not to say that they necessarily outsold those American cars. They just lasted longer. They lasted longer because they were better built. They were simply better built. It's a fact in the matter. I'm not going to spend all my time ranting on how these car companies were killed by the Germans and the Japanese, but these basically were better offerings. If I were to speak objectively, not with my own emotion, they were better than the traditional American luxury cars. Like I said, the Americans had gotten down their formula to such a science, to such an exact formula, that when the time came for them to change quickly, as quick as the Germans and the Japanese invaded with their cars, it wasn't conducive. It was so exact that they could only do it that way. They couldn't change it. They had to come up with a completely new class of vehicles, which is what brings me to my next point. The neo-traditionals. The neo-traditional American cars were basically invented to combat the Germans and the Japanese while still offering a unique American flavor. This was not to say that the traditional American luxury car did not coexist with the neo-traditional American luxury car. The death of the traditional luxury car in America was actually finalized in 2011 with the discontinuation of the Lincoln Town Car and the Mercury Grand Marquis. Cadillac and basically GM discontinued their traditional luxury cars in 1996 with the Fleetwood and the Buick Roadmaster. Chrysler had done away with that since the 70s because the 80s was a time of restructuring for Chrysler. So Chrysler had done away with like the likes of the Imperial, like the traditional Imperial, in the late 70s, early 80s. So they were no longer offering things of that sort. And the neo-traditionals coexisted with these cars. Neo-traditional American luxury cars, many were front-wheel drive, not always though. They were smaller and baby versions of the big boys, so to speak. So you had the Cadillac DeVille, not the Cadillac DeVille in the 70s, but we're talking about the Cadillac DeVille started in the mid-1980s, like 85 and onward. These were front-wheel drive cars. They were much smaller than the Fleetwood. They had more efficient engines. They were unibody construction. They were European-esque in their engineering, but not necessarily in their style. They still offered a boulevard ride, as Jay Leno would say. You had the Lincoln Continental started in the early 90s. The Lincoln Continental continued with the Continental Mark series up until like the Mark 8 when it came back to Lincoln. And then you had, oh dear, what else did you have? Let me think. Yeah, the Lincoln Town Car that came in and replaced the Lincoln Continental as the flagship Lincoln, and then the Continental moved down to the midsize, and it became the neo-traditional luxury car, and that ended in 2002. Funny enough, Lincoln's traditional car outlasted its neo-traditional car. The Town Car lasted until 2011. The Continental only lasted until 2002. The Chrysler New Yorker had cab-forward design, very unique. Cab-forward, it had a sloped front end that offered more legroom in the front without making the car longer, because I guess the passenger compartment sloped over partly over the engine compartment. It was complicated as far as to explain the design. Point is, it was very futuristic looking. It was very unique, and it still offered that American boulevard ride in a completely new style. So Chrysler really, I mean, they really invented a new sort of car. As successful as they were, I don't know if they were extremely successful, but they were very unique, and props to them for that. The Oldsmobile Aurora, which was almost like a cab-forward design, but offering from GM, was a very futuristic version that still offered traditional components of the American traditional luxury sedan. And then you had the Buick Park Avenue. The Buick Park Avenue front-wheel drive, based on the same platform as the Cadillac DeVille. The Buick Park Avenue was introduced in, there was an electric Park Avenue from like 1988 to 1991, but the Buick Park Avenue was offered, I believe, in 1993 and ended until 2005. I actually own a Buick Park Avenue of the second generation with the Buick 3800 V6 front-wheel drive. These cars were, again, neo-traditional. They kept the styling of the old cars, but the underpinnings were unibody, front-wheel drive, very reminiscent of offerings from Germany, offerings from Japan, front-wheel drive, unibody construction, that made them more competitive as far as the market went. So, yeah, that was basically what happened with the American traditional luxury sedan. And the neo-traditional luxury sedan would be basically killed off in 2011 as well, with the end of the Cadillac DeVille series. By that time, the Cadillac DeVille was shortened to DTS, but it was still a DeVille in my book nonetheless, was ended in 2011. Mercury was axed in 2011. The Mercury car division just didn't exist anymore. Oldsmobile ended earlier, 7 years earlier in 2004. Oldsmobiles just weren't selling anymore. The traditional American luxury sedan and the neo-traditional American luxury sedan were all killed off in 2011, and the luxury coupes were killed off in like the early 2000s. So this was all due to competition that they simply just couldn't face from the Germans and the Japanese, and they had to offer new sorts of American luxury cars. And nowadays, they're not even offering American luxury cars at all. So please stay tuned for the final segment, in which I talk about how much I miss traditional American luxury, what my opinion is, and what I see the future holds, and what I see the current trends are as far as luxury cars in America are concerned. So please stay tuned after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, my fellow car lovers. This is my segment in which I can just talk. I can talk about how much I miss traditional American luxury. Comfort, simplicity, and build quality were king, like I mentioned earlier. I have always been known as an old soul. I was born in the late 1990s. I'm only 22 years old. But I long for things of the past. I love antiques. I love antique furniture, antique silverware, antique plates, anything antique, antique technology. I think it's all wonderful. I think it's all super cool. And this translates into my love of cars too. I love antique automobiles. I love traditional automobiles. I love classic automobiles. And as a result, I love the traditional American luxury car probably more than any sort of class of car on the face of the earth. These cars were something else. This was what America was. This was the personification of America in the car form. I believe that art is always a product of its surroundings, a product of its culture, a product of the artist's culture. When you had people like Harley Earl back in the 1940s designing the very first Cadillac fins, this was very reminiscent. This was very tied in to what Harley Earl's culture was. He was an American. This was big, flashy, luxurious, excessive. These were the American traits that translated into American luxury car design and American luxury car build quality. This was an art form that was truly like none other. When you think of it, cars from overseas weren't necessarily seen as art forms per se. Japanese cars of the time period were not known for being pretty. They were known for being efficient and functional. And by the time period, I'm talking about 1950s to 1970s. I mean, not to say that there weren't pretty designs that came out. I want to say, the Toyota 2000 GT. I mean, that was a beautiful car. But that was not the main focus of Japanese car culture, Japanese car philosophy. It was, and still remains, efficiency above all else. German cars were all about engineering. German cars of the time period weren't necessarily beautiful. Some of the S-classes, you see, I mean, they looked kind of funky. I mean, they had like these fin tails at the end, but they weren't like fins like American car company. They were like, they looked like honestly pointed cat ears on the back of some of the old Mercedes Benzes. And you had the shark nose BMWs that weren't necessarily beautiful. They had these big ugly bumpers. I mean, and of course I can't forget, Saab, and Volvo from Sweden. These cars were not beautiful. They were functional. They were safe. They were luxurious. They were well built. But I mean, Americans really, really focused on styling. It was an art form. And I miss that. You can't see cars like the 1959 Cadillac anymore nowadays. Safety regulations and people's taste wouldn't allow something as ridiculous as that to exist. You can't find Buicks like the Electra 225 from 1959 with the large delta wings on the back. This car looked like a rocket ship. You can't find Lincoln Continentals and Lincoln Premiers of the late 1950s, early 1960s that had slanted headlights, trapezoidal grills, scalloped fenders, breezeway windows. I mean, God gracious, you can't find things like that anymore. It harkens back to a different era. It harkens back to a different philosophy. These cars were art forms. Even the British cars, which have always been classically beautiful, like Jaguars and Rolls Royces and Bentleys, these cars were not as ridiculous as the American cars. And I know I use the term ridiculous, but I use that in the most affectionate way possible. It was fun. It was fun-loving. It was romantic. It was beautiful. It was what America stood for at the time. I mean, we had economic prosperity. These were the good old days. These were the days of, sock hops and rock and roll and Elvis and drive-in movie theaters and Hollywood. I mean, these were the great old days where people can afford to, have a car that gets 10 miles per gallon. I mean, this was a time. It was a different time, you understand. This was it's the reason why I miss it. It harkens back to an era that is unknown to many of us today, us youngins. We can ask our grandparents, our great-grandparents, if they're still with us, what it was like to own a Cadillac. I mean, my friend Maggie from when I used to work at Hallmark, Maggie said that the Cadillacs today don't hold a candle to Cadillacs of old. She's like, when you got a car and it was a Cadillac, you know you had a car. It was big. It was heavy. It had chrome bumpers. It was comfortable. You had lots of metal surrounding you. She's like, it's none of this plastic foolishness that they have on cars today. She didn't use the word foolishness, but, let your mind wander. But, when you have people like that, Maggie, who's turning 83 this year, she can attest to what it was like to own a Cadillac. Nancy Fry, a great friend of mine from Hallmark, she and her husband owned a Cadillac back in the 80s. I mean, she knew, even though this was towards the decline of the American luxury, the traditional American luxury sedan, but she knew what a Cadillac was. And they all loved my Cadillacs. They all loved my Buick because this was something that reminded them of their young adult days, their middle-aged days, when they, just freshly started, retirement, and this was the car that they had. Now they were, in their twilight years, so to speak. So they drove cars that were more efficient, cars that were really more modern. But when they had just retired and they and their husbands felt like a Cadillac was justifiable for them to buy, I mean, these were things that reminded them of the days of old. And part of me longs for the days of old too. Whenever I look at the traditional American luxury cars, this was something of an art form that sadly may never be seen again. I mean, you don't see frescoes like what Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel anymore. You don't see that sort of art anymore. You don't see the sorts of art from Picasso and from Van Gogh and from Da Vinci like the Mona Lisa. You don't see that sort of art anymore. That was a specific time in history, and it's been preserved for people who wanted to preserve it for future generations, for posterity. The American luxury car is the same way. What it differs is that this is a functional piece of art. It gets you from point A to point B in a comfortable manner, but when you look at it in itself, it is an art form. The philosophy behind it is truly an art form. And I feel like the cars of today, not to say that they aren't beautiful, they're much better looking than cars of old, but the intention is not there. The intention is not to make an art form. The intention is to make an efficient and economically viable piece of machinery, which it demands respect in its own right, I should say. But it is not what I love, and it is not what people of Maggie's generation, people of Nancy's generation, this is not what they are used to. This is not what they know. This is not what they love. What I think is actually happening, I believe that Hyundai with the Genesis and Toyota with the Lexus, Honda with the Acura, Nissan with the Infiniti, even though Infiniti is sort of floundering right now, I believe they have come in and really filled in that market segment of where American luxury cars used to be. As we know, Lincoln has announced that it is killing the Continental and the MKZ and focusing only on crossovers. We've been hearing this song being sung for probably the past year or two in the American car community. They're finally doing it, and I believe 2020 is the last year for the Continental and the MKZ. I believe 2021, they're only focusing on the Corsair, the Nautilus, the Aviator, and the Navigator, which are their crossover SUVs and their traditional SUV in the form of the Navigator. Cadillac, we had thought was killing off all of their sedans, but apparently they're still holding off in the sedan game. They're the only ones, along with Chrysler, that still offer sedans, and many of the other traditional luxury marks that you know of have been killed off. Buick doesn't offer cars for America anymore. Only the crossovers in the form of the Encore, the Envision, and the Enclave. Buick, however, 80% of Buicks are sold in China, in which they have sedans, they have minivans, they have crossovers, they have all sorts of foolishness over in China. So Buick luxury cars still exist, just not for America, for China now. It's the end of an era. It's the end of an era. Genesis is coming in with the G70, the G80, and the G90, which are not traditional American luxury cars, obviously. Those cars are from South Korea. But they fill in the market. They fill in the price range, and they fill in what American luxury cars used to be. Honda has the Acura with the TLX and the RL. I don't even know if they still make the RL. I'm so old-fashioned. I'm so antiquated in my thinking. I can't keep up with all the new stuff Acura is doing nowadays. But they still have sedans. Toyota with Lexus still has the ES, the LS. I don't think they have the GS anymore, though. I think they're killing off the GS. But they still have the luxury sedans that really offer what American luxury cars used to offer, but in a modern package. And Cadillac obviously still offers their cars, and Cadillac is basically trying to chase the Germans, which I already had a whole rant about that. And I'm going to mention Chrysler. Chrysler still has the 300. The Chrysler 300 has not been what Chrysler has always been over the years, but the Chrysler 300 nonetheless exists, and it is an American luxury car. So I would say the American luxury car is almost dead, not quite, but it's definitely on the way out. And I thank you all for listening to this GSMC car podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I would thank you and very much appreciate you as well. So thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.